sunshine. I realize I am in sunshine. The skies are turning blue. Would you like to go to...
Welcome to another interview here with Accept Truth with Joy. And I am so happy today to be with Dr. Terryl Givens, who was born in upstate New York. He was raised in the American Southwest and did graduate work in intellectual history at Cornell and comparative literature at Chapel Hill. And he's just done a ton of things. He was a professor at the University of Richmond, taught courses in Romanticism, 19th century cultural studies, Bible and literature. And currently we're now in the new building that I just found out on the BYU campus. He's the senior fellow in the Neil L. Maxwell Institute. And he's published in tons of different things: literary theory, British and European Romanticism, more recently in a lot in Mormon studies and intellectual history. He's been interviewed by dozens and dozens of people, both on NPR, CNN. He was actually the first time I ever saw you physically was on Frontlines, the Mormons. Oh, so yeah. that was my first introduction to you, and since then, of course, I've followed your career, and he's authored or edited, I think, 21 or 22 books, somewhere around there, and I'm just like a little giddy schoolgirl right now in front of Dr. Terryl Givens. So thank you for being here.
Good to be here with you again, Heath.
Thank you. Yeah, and he's kind of returning maybe the favor. I don't know how much of a favor it was, but I was interviewed by him for Faith Matters. Yeah. And that was a while ago now.
Well, it must be close to a year ago since we were in the old building.
Right. Yep. And it was before COVID hit us. So, so thank you for being with me. I don't know if my introduction was long enough there, but
that was plenty adequate.
What else would you like to say maybe about as an introduction to yourself? Especially, I mean, everyone, or I'm sure most of my listeners and most people know you from the work that you do with faith crises and Book of Mormon history and all of that stuff. But maybe you could give us a little bit of an introduction of how your interest in, like, what's your history and how does that brought you to an interest in science?
In science? Yeah. Well, it's not... Okay, there are, I guess, two paths that have led me here. One is that I have always passionately loved physics. In fact, well into my graduate study at Chapel Hill, I actually met with somebody from the physics department to see if I could switch into the PhD program in physics. And I was missing enough coursework that it would have taken me a good while to get through it. But that's how strongly I've felt drawn to the sciences through the years. And then as I've become more deeply engaged in LDS theology, restoration theology, it seems to me that the lines that divide science from the humanities, humanistic disciplines like theology or literature, grow fainter and fainter. And so I'm a big fan of the old classic essay by C.P. Snow called The Two Cultures. And most people today probably unfamiliar with that. It was a great kind of paradigm challenging essay at the time, about 1959, I think it came out. And C.P. Snow's argument was that we have this artificial divide between the humanities and science, and it's destructive of both. And I think as Latter-day Saints, we should be especially primed to look for interrelationships and correlations and synergy between the sciences and theology, because, when we hear that all truth can be circumscribed in one great whole, that's more than just a platitude.
Right.
And I think one of my favorite sayings that Brigham Young ever uttered was, he's talking about the revelation about the earth becoming a celestialized sphere, a perfected sea of glass. And he says, how will that happen? And he answers his own question by saying, by the scientists who are best instructed in chemistry, the angels who are best instructed in chemistry. And to me, there's something humorous about the kind of juxtaposition of angels in chemistry classes, and yet he's penetrated there, I think, to the heart of what sets restoration theology apart, which is we really do believe that the process of acquiring godliness will encompass learning across the spectrum.
Yeah.
And so science, right, the study of how things are and what things are and how things change and transform, what could be more central, it seems to me, to an eternal education than science. So it's a natural drawing to that discipline that I feel.
Now, I've heard you say that your wife, Fiona, says that you spend your off time reading science, right?
Yeah.
What science do you like to read? I mean, I think this would surprise a lot of people, that it's like, what are you doing in your off time? Well, in addition to creating, Joseph Smith's library, which you showed me and is a fantastic here behind me, but
yeah,
what is it? What is it in science that you read?
At least, I guess, 3 different subfields of science that I'm particularly fascinated by, and I really do spend a lot of time every week immersed. One area is cognitive science. And in fact, my son Nathaniel and I are finishing up a manuscript on the relationship between cognitive science and faith. So people like Timothy Wilson and Franz de Waal and Daniel Kahneman and other people who are kind of reformulating models of the self and of the relationship between faith and reason. So that's one area I'm especially interested in. My real passion is quantum physics. I'm an absolute amateur. I don't make any pretensions to be an expert in the field. But I've always been intrigued by quantum physics. I'm especially interested in recent challenges to the Copenhagen interpretation of the dual slit experiment. I don't know if that's too technical for many of your listeners, right? But the famous dual slit experiment was kind of the foundation of a modern understanding of quantum physics, whereby locality and determinism and realism are effectively annihilated. And so we inhabit a universe completely different from the one that Newton envisioned. And Einstein resisted, right, these innovations, but most people today kind of consider him a dinosaur who couldn't quite adapt to the changing scientific paradigms. But now there's a resurgence of kind of taking Einstein more seriously and seeing if there aren't ways that we can recapture these principles of realism and the predictability of nature by positing new interpretive models of quantum physics. And so I read Hugh Everett and David Bohm,
Sure,
and others in that.
Now, is your interest, though, purely in the science, or are you finding areas that are exciting in your overlap with theology and Mormonism?
Well, yes. Here's where I find some of the more interesting possible. On the one hand, I just think we need to learn the lessons of modern physics, which are that we cannot reduce the universe to those 3-dimensional models in which we operate, right? Principles of non-locality, for example, prove that the universe doesn't really exist in the way that we want to envision it. So there is no way of physically representing reality at the subatomic level. And so that it seems to me, should provoke in us a tremendous epistemological humility that we are limited in the way that we can measure and represent and understand reality. And so I think there are important lessons to be learned in terms of faith and discipleship. But I also think that there are a lot of developments in cosmology and physics that should have an interesting appeal to Latter-day Saint thinkers. For example, increasingly you find a number, and this is where we'll be getting more into your specialty, but we have a number of scientists who are arguing that evolution is doubtless true, but it may not be complete enough as a model to explain evolutionary history and the development of things like consciousness. And so you have people like Thomas Nagel, you have people in physics like Stuart Kauffman, who are arguing that there have to be principles of self-organization. And that's the term that keeps coming up, these self-organizing principles at work that tend to push material reality in the direction of ever greater complexity. Now, you can't read theorists like that and not hear in the back of your mind King Follett.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith's notions of this kind of evolutionary, cosmic evolution that is behind the emergence of intelligence in the universe and the development of even gods. And so it seems to me that ultimately we will have to find a way of explaining in terms of natural law those principles that are foundational to our theology. Because, again, they have to be interrelated, ultimately.
Now, in your own history, did you ever experience like conflict between science and religion, in particular with like Mormon supposed doctrines? Maybe they weren't. Did you ever have those kind of conflicts?
The only time I remember that was I'm a child of the 70s, and so I remember Elder McConkie's famous 7 heresies of Mormonism, and evolution was one of those. And I was a good, obedient, Orthodox Latter-day Saint in those days, and so I was troubled by the evidence for evolution and my understanding that the church stood opposed to evolution. And of course the conflict was resolved not when I definitively gave up evolution, but when I definitively gave up certain pronouncements that weren't made with the assent of the entire quorum, but by individuals like Elder McConkie. In more recent years, I really can't think of a single instance where I felt troubled by any of the claims of science and how they might rub against our doctrines. Recent kerfuffles like the DNA in the Book of Mormon always struck me as non-starters. I never thought those scientific critiques really deserve to be taken seriously, and I still don't. So, in general terms, no.
Great. Now, you spent, I remember in one of your podcasts, you talked a lot about how there was a time period where you read almost every anti-Mormon thing that you could get your hands on.
Yep.
And do you see any similarities between anti-Mormonism and anti-science movements?
I can't think of any similarity or overlap other than just a kind of generalized, provincialism, I guess, closedness. I think it was Eyring, right? The senior Eyring, who said, "The Lord will never require you to believe anything that isn't true." And that might not seem like a profound spark of genius, but it really is, because if our allegiance is to truth, then it seems to me that we have to live with a kind of perpetual openness, just an openness.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that anti-scientism and anti-Mormonism are both driven by a kind of obsession on a couple of claims and a resistance to any wider perspective that challenges those fairly narrow claims. So I guess just in terms of attitude and approach, I guess I find those two similar.
Sometimes as I've now taught evolution for 15, 20 years now, I sometimes find that the strategies that I use to try to help students accept evolution are similar to the strategies that I used as a missionary to help people accept the possibility of new prophets.
Yeah.
Right? Because I served in Chile, and so most people already believed in Christ and all of that. It was an issue of, could they believe that new revelations, new prophets, new scripture could be a possibility? And until they accepted that as a possibility, there was no way they were going to ever listen to me about, Joseph Smith and all of the other stuff that comes with Joseph Smith, Book of Mormons and all that stuff.
Right.
And I wonder, do you kind of share that position that in some sense, we've got to get people to that openness that you just said, because if they're closed to it, then it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what evidence you share, they're never going to accept, an old earth or evolution or, a Big Bang, potentially an explanation, for the universe.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite science writers is Marcelo Gleiser, and he's a Brazilian, a physicist and cosmologist. And he's written a book called The Island of Knowledge. And his thesis, and then he's written another book, A Crack at the Edge of Creation. And one of his favorite themes he keeps coming back to is the more science advances, the more we will become aware of these vast areas of ignorance. And so he's setting himself up against this tradition of a kind of the inevitability of the conquest of all knowledge. And he's saying, no, it's the other way around. Even such principles as the uncertainty principle, right, which which posit as absolute scientific fact that we cannot know, right, certain pairings of information, of facts. And so there again, it seems to me that I think, was it Rutherford in the late 19th century who said effectively, we've learned most everything we're going to learn, right? We've got reality down. We understand the model of the atom, and science is coming to an end, right? And now we've just reversed course 180 degrees, and there's this widespread recognition that we may never come to a theory of everything. And so it seems to me that one of the greatest challenges to Latter-day Saints in some varieties of faith crisis is not science, but scientism. People who are really well versed in the scientific disciplines know that no paradigm is ever final, no word is ever definitive. But there's this, I think, naive kind of sense that no, if we really want access to truth that is the most reliable, then we go with a scientific method. And I just think that's a kind of childish, misplaced faith. And so there again, I think it's the epistemic humility that modern science really teaches us.
Interesting. Let's geek out for just a little bit. I want you to, this interview is very different than probably a lot of your other interviews, which are dealing with
a little bit
with other things. But what cool science ideas does Terryl Givens think about, and that perhaps you're on this edge of, this idea could really be faith promoting. This idea could really be deep in our understanding of who we are, or something like that. Yeah. Are you toying around with any of that stuff?
Well, yeah, I guess the one idea that I keep finding mentioned explicitly in, Thomas Nagel writes on this, a brilliant contemporary philosopher, but so do a number of cosmologists, are kind of revisiting the principle of what they call panpsychism. And Orson Pratt, right, maybe the earliest speculative theologian in Latter-day Saint thought, believed in panpsychism, which means that matter is intelligent at its most fundamental levels before it even comes together into agents, into sentient beings. And so here there's an interesting convergence between a number of writers in various scientific fields and this idea, which was Orson Pratt's reading of the King Follett principle, which is that we can only make sense of self-awareness and sentience and consciousness and the quality of experience if we posit that at the most fundamental levels of reality there is intelligence. And I've always thought that if I wasn't a Latter-day Saint, I would have to be an atheist. Because I've never been able to embrace the kind of classical conception of God as this eternally self-existent, grandfatherly Santa Claus figure that just happened to always be there in our shape and form and image, loving us. It's just a bridge too far for me. But I can believe, as a kind of scientific principle, that the universe has always consisted of matter that at some level is intelligent, and that there are these principles of self-organization that will eventually lead to spirit beings and eventually to gods. I mean, it's like Richard Dawkins, right? Probably the most famous neo-atheist of our age, who once said in an NPR interview, well, I could believe in God if he were just a super-evolved human being. Well, welcome to King Follett. And so I do spend time thinking about that and finding great satisfaction in the fact that ideas so consistent with our conception of deity are being taken seriously by both philosophers and scientists alike.
I love that. Many of the LDS essays, or even recent CES curriculum movements that have been happening, are addressing more and more the historical and the doctrinal issues that have been problematic through the years. And maybe there's been a few of those that have kind of tangentially kind of hit on science stuff, like DNA in the Book of Mormon, I think comes to mind as one of these. Do you think the church could or should address more science topics in these kind of formal projects that they're doing?
Well, they certainly could. I personally would be delighted to see other aspects of the gospel, other emphases in our gospel articulated that are consistent with environmentalism, or care for the earth, respect for science, which is such a problem in the political sphere today. And it seems to me that the church could either do that in specific areas. Why not reaffirm core Latter-day Saint teachings about stewardship over the earth? But they could also do it in a much more general way. I would love to see an essay that simply revisits Joseph Smith's kind of all-encompassing, right, mind that celebrated all branches of learning and all disciplines. I mean, we even have verses in the Doctrine and Covenants that affirm the value of a widespread spiritual curriculum. And so I think it would be a tremendously helpful and healthy thing if the church were to officially remind us that we have this heritage. Because our church has gone through pendulum swings as an institution, as a cultural institution, right? In the initial days, the School of the Prophets, and founding the University of Nauvoo and the Polysophical Society in Utah, there was just this fervent passion for learning, and learning in the broadest sense of the word. And then, right, you get to the 1930s failed experiment with Chicago Divinity School, and there's this retrenchment, and then you get this kind of the Clark statement on the charted course of education, and it's kind of a retreat from trying to engage with the world. And then we kind of swing back a little bit with Elder Ballard's important CES address of, what was that, 217 or 218, in which he said, a testimony is not an answer to a question. And so once again, there's this recognition that no, we have to engage the world of scholarship and of science and of reason, and find that such an approach supports our faith. It doesn't threaten it. So yeah, I would love for the official church to remind us of what our true heritage is in this regard.
Yeah, because I've talked to other people, and it's like, I would love them because I'm an evolutionary biologist, and because evolutionary biology touches on origins of man and of who we are, which is a really fundamental question of the church. And I would love them to address that. But at the same time, I don't think that the church has to make an essay for every single scientific principle out there. Like, they don't need to say, we agree that Newton's laws of gravities are these, Like, I don't think that's necessary either. But there are some of these where I wish they would be a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah.
You share that view maybe with some things?
I do. And I mean, that's the course that the Catholic Church has taken in recent generations, has been to simply state that we honor and value the contributions of science, and we're not threatened by them. We embrace with open arms the findings of the best thinkers of our day. And we don't accept those propositions as dogma, but we accept them openly and curiously. And I think that's the appropriate response.
It's interesting. I'm a bishop right now, and so Sunday ago, I got up and a state councilor or a high councilor read kind of an updated, here's where the state's policy is concerning wearing masks if you're vaccinated, based on what the CDC said. And then I, as a bishop, reread kind of the first presidency's statement, on that they're urging people to be vaccinated, but it's your choice if you don't want to be. But, they've donated all this money and stuff to vaccination efforts. All of them got vaccinated. So for me, I guess I took the liberty as a bishop to kind of go, clearly the position of the church is that we should try to get vaccinated if we can. And after the meeting, I had someone come into my office and rebuke me, basically, and say I didn't have the right to tell him over and over and emphasize that we should get vaccinated. And then that led to a 40-minute discussion of all things weird in this.
Yeah.
But it was interesting for me because I thought this was probably the one time that this person felt a little bit of conflict in their worldview, because the first presidency didn't agree with their anti-vaccination position.
Right.
and they could not handle it. It was terrible. And I thought, boy, now I wonder if this person realizes this is how many people have felt for years and years who have rubbed up against certain policies or doctrinal issues within the church, and had to make the choice to either leave or stay. Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. This will go down in history as one of those moments, kind of like President Kimball's statement on the MX missile, or his statement against recreational hunting, where you clearly were bumping up against cultural Mormonism. And I think that's the problem here again. There shouldn't be anything highly controversial about leaders of the church trying to align us with the best scientific understanding of the day.
Yeah. And maybe if there were more pro-science kind of, as you're saying, these essays or something, maybe that could lessen the blow for those.
Right.
For that.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I think, I found this was the case especially in Europe, as Fiona and I have traveled a good bit, giving firesides and talking to members with faith challenges around the world. And we find that the resources of members of the church outside of the United States are, of course, much more severely limited than we are here in the States. And it's been our discovery that in many cases they're still pretty much locked into the 1970s and 80s, because the resources they still have are the resources of the 1970s and 80s, which tended to be at times virulently anti-science.
And what proportion, because you guys have talked to thousands and thousands of people in these faith transitions, what proportion of those people are struggling not with, maybe they are struggling with polygamy or blacks in the priesthood or whatever, but how many of those people are also struggling with like scientific conflict?
Certainly a significant percentage, but I would say more broadly speaking, it's what they see as a conflict between rationalism and faith. And science, of course, is an important subsect of rationalism. But there again, the irony is that it's becoming almost a truism among evolutionary biologists as well as philosophers that there is nothing in evolutionary history that should lead us to have confidence that our rational faculties give us an accurate depiction of reality, right? Our minds evolved to help us survive, not in order to penetrate the mysteries of the universe. Mm-hmm. And so there again, there's a misplaced kind of faith and confidence and trust in unaided rationality, which is not scientific or philosophically sound.
I wonder if you could revisit something from one of your books. It was in Crucible of Doubt, where you talked about B.H. Roberts and how he was dealing with the Book of Mormon thing, and you talked about how paradigms, the paradigm he was in was causing this conflict for him. Could you maybe address that issue? Like how maybe many people who are going to watch this, maybe they're having a hard time, accepting evolution or accepting, but do you think perhaps that might be because of their paradigm? Could you maybe speak to the B.H. Roberts thing and how that might be addressable here?
The tough thing about paradigms is it's like, the example, what would a fish say if you asked it what it's like to be wet? And the fish would say, what is wet? So the problem with paradigms is that we are so deeply immersed in given paradigms that we're not generally cognizant of them. We're not aware of the presuppositions we bring to a confrontation with any challenge, any idea or proposition. But one can look back retroactively and see moments in our history as individuals or as a church where it's clear that there were paradigms for which there was no good reason that got us into trouble. The example I give is B.H. Roberts, who grew up, as most Latter-day Saints have, with the assumption, right, the belief, the paradigm that the Book of Mormon describes a hemispheric history from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. And consequently, when he confronted the challenge of how do you explain how Hebrew could have evolved into hundreds and hundreds of American Indian languages in just a few hundred years, few centuries, he could never resolve that, and he went to his death still troubled by his inability to reconcile these divergent truths. And of course, now most of us are aware, because of more careful textual examination of the Book of Mormon, following in the wake of Sorensen, and he wasn't the first, but he was the most famous, John Sorensen, who demonstrated that if you correlate all the geographical allusions in the Book of Mormon, you come up with a an area of action that is about 200 by 300 miles. And suddenly all of these problems just disappear that you thought were challenges to Book of Mormon veracity. So the problem was in the assumption that he never questioned rigorously enough. And I think that there are comparable problems just across the scope of challenges to our faith today. Like, well, the Book of Abraham clearly didn't emerge in the way that we thought it did. Well, maybe we need to rethink translation. Maybe we need to rethink how a prophet works and operates. And so it seems to me that when, I think it was President Uchtdorf who said, was it he who said, you need to doubt your doubts? I guess I would say, yeah, I would just reformulate that as ask yourself what assumptions are creating that problem. I'll never forget one of the very, very first times that I ever remember self-consciously engaging another member of the church who was troubled and had made the tentative decision to leave the faith upon completing her mission. And so she came and we spoke for some hours into the night with her mission president's permission. And she was particularly upset at something about Joseph Smith. And I remember I finally asked the question, why does that matter to you? This failure of judgment on his part. What does that have to do with your commitment to Christ? Your belief in the restoration? And I'll never forget, she thought a minute. And then she suddenly said, I don't know. It's like she just thought she was supposed to react with indignation and lost, right? Until she realized, oh, well, I guess I had a certain paradigm in place about how prophets are supposed to act and what their moral character will unfailingly be.
Yeah.
And once she questioned that, then suddenly the problem diminished in relative significance.
Yes. I find that a lot with human evolution, where Mormons have a particular paradigm in which they function, where the body had to have been this special creative act.
Right.
And so therefore it couldn't have been evolution that created the physical body. But I've found that if I can help them say, well, does that even matter? Who cares how the body got here? Doesn't it? I'm a child of God, not because God was the father of your physical body, but because he's the father of your spirit.
Right.
So if you change the paradigm, it's like I have dozens and dozens and dozens of students I've talked to who, as soon as I just do that little tweak with them, it just opens them up. Like,
there isn't a conflict with anything essential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they go through that.
Yeah.
How would you approach a fellow ward member, let's say you're sitting in church, that thinks that science is unimportant to religious thought?
Yeah. Okay, let me generalize that question, right? How would I approach a fellow ward member who insisted that the flood was literal or
Sure,
right?
Yeah, any of that stuff.
And here, this may sound like a cop-out, but I would say my response would always depend on how much credit I had built up in that ward. And
how do you build credit?
You build credit by service and by love and by being fully in the game. And so if I were a visitor in a strange ward and heard that taking place and felt that I probably couldn't issue a dissenting view or correction without creating contention or offense, I wouldn't do it. But if I were part of a ward where they knew me and loved me, knew that my commitment was unflagging to the gospel and to them, then I would be in a position to say something that would be less likely to cause offense and more likely to be.
And what would that conversation, let's say someone actually did say that, well, and as we know, there was a worldwide flood that was 4,000 years ago, and every single peak of this entire earth was covered with water.
Yeah.
In, how would you, what would be your conversation there? Would you do it right in front of the class, or would you maybe wait until after? Or?
Well, I probably would do it in front of the class if I felt that there were others that were being persuaded of inaccurate doctrinal claims. And I think the best response is always one that doesn't match opinion with opinion, but matches opinion with actual sources, actual authoritative sources. And so I think in this case we have abundant sources that tell us that the scriptural record is imperfect, that Joseph Smith talked about the plain and precious things that had been lost, that he said there are many things in the scriptures that do not accord with the revelations of God to me. And I think that we have a solid enough foundation that challenges this kind of literalism and fundamentalism, that we should be comfortable invoking those sources.
And if they double down and pull out their Joseph Fielding Smith source in front of you?
Well, as I said to one person recently who insisted that God is vindictive and retributive, I said, if that's the God that you want to embrace, I'm not going to try to dissuade you. And sometimes that's the best we can do, is just not try to compel belief.
Yeah, well, I love that principle of like, if you've got credit, if you got cred, right?
Cred.
You got to have cred.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I love that. Anything else that you'd like to talk about? Because I know this, I want you to geek out on any science thing that you would like to, that you've always like, I wish they would have asked me about this science thing.
No, I'll probably remember all of that later. No, nothing else. I just wish that we could all have the same kind of intellectual passion that Joseph Smith clearly had. And I guess I would say this, that if you look at those times when Joseph did seem to err in judgment, and I think there are times when he himself wasn't even self-aware of how prophetic processes were at work, any more than Paul did, who said, right, I don't know if I was in the body or out of the body. But for me personally, because I feel that he was a kindred spirit, I am able to excuse him and give him a lot of latitude because of the excitement with which he pursued this project. This belief that the heavens were open, that there are no limitations on what we can know, that God does not want to steward these mysteries and keep us in subjection and in fear. And so, as I said, if we could just love and seek truth, and it's like I said to myself when I first began my book on the Book of Mormon. I had made the determination I was going to read every anti-Book of Mormon treatise I could find, and I did. And my presupposition going into that was, if the Book of Mormon isn't strong enough to withstand the most furious assaults of the critics, then it doesn't deserve my faith. And I think the same is true of the gospel, that we have to be less nervous and afraid of potential conflicts, and know that if there ever does arise a conflict between science and the gospel, it's really going to be a conflict between our understanding of science and our understanding of the gospel, and have confidence that ultimately they can be reconciled. And just approach your discipleship as an intellectual adventure.
Love that. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't, before this ended, tell you that when I was having my kind of dark night of faith transition, I don't think I was ever that terrible, but that I was starting to question a lot of things in relation to, a lot of the historical stuff. And I remember listening to the interview, that 5-hour interview that you did with, John DeLynn. With John DeLynn.
There, you made me say the name.
Yeah. Oh, then, well, we can edit that. But that interview that you did, I used to listen to that over and over as I'd mow the lawn or whatever. And just so many things resounded with me, and it just brought back kind of like, I can do this, I can be a part of this. Not that, I don't know that I was going to leave. But in my soul, I was having some issues, and you brought me peace, and I just want to thank you for that.
Appreciate that. Thank you for letting me know, Heath. That was certainly one of the earliest and the longest engagements I had with somebody who was challenging every dimension and every facet of my faith. And I think I came out of that realizing that to go back to paradigms, we can't live outside of a narrative that we construct, a global paradigm in which we make sense of ourselves and our relationship to the divine. And I have only grown in my confidence in the gospel as years have gone by, because I have come to learn that it answers the most pressing questions of our existence more thoroughly and more compellingly than any other philosophical or religious system. And I just hope all those who are committed to the gospel can get to that same point of love and confidence for the thoroughness of the great story that Joseph Smith restored to us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with me today, and it's been a real pleasure, and I know that this is going to be one of the most popular episodes perhaps that I've done, so I really appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Sunshine with me. The doors are open, the skies are too. Sunshine is coming in for me and you. Sunshine.